Hello, I'm Colin Fairley. I'm a pragmatist philosopher and political theorist based at Queen's University in Canada. And this video is the third and final installment on Chapter 11 of my new book, Aging and the Ethics of Longevity Science. For those of you that have been following along on these videos, the last two videos on Chapter 11, titled Climate Geroscience, were amplifying how the science of healthy aging is critically important for climate science and ensuring that human and planetary health is better promoted in the future for human and non-human species. And so in this final installment video, I'm going to try to offer some practical prescriptions about how we can foster more collaboration between two areas of science that historically have had very little collaboration between them. And in order to do that, I'm going to diagnose in a kind of forensic fashion some of the shortcomings of the current scientific enterprise and offer some potential solutions to remedying those shortcomings. If you recall from the previous video, I talked about the policy options both for abating the harms of climate change and then for those designed to address the phenomena of population aging. With climate change, we typically will focus on mitigation and adaptation. Both of these are important. You wouldn't want to pursue just one in isolation. And similarly, I want to suggest that the ideal of rate control is absolutely imperative for addressing the problems of population aging in a warming world, but we are still predominantly fixating on the aspirations only of disease control. And while I'm not suggesting we abandon the project of disease control, a consequence of further success in simply extending lifespan, but not healthy lifespan, is going to exacerbate the challenges of a warming world. So instead, I want to amplify the potential benefits of slowing human aging, both for the mitigation of greenhouse gas emissions. In the last video, I talked about how improving human health in late life will reduce the greenhouse gas emissions from the world's healthcare systems. It may also reduce the greenhouse gas emissions from agricultural animals by extending the productive lifespan of dairy cattle, for example, so that it's closer approximates their lifespan, and also for our companion pets. Extending the duration of healthy aging for companion pets will mean that we can reap comparable levels of companionship with our pets with less greenhouse gas emissions from the energy consumption requirements of rearing many more puppies, for example, than having, once those puppies become adult dogs, to have them age in a more healthy manner when they consume less energy in later life. And it's also critical to adaptation, that is, boosting our biological resilience to the onset of age-related conditions will be particularly critical in an aging and warming future, right? So one of the problems of living that Maxwell reminds us to address is that we are living in a warming planet, one where 3 billion people will be over age 60 by the year 2100. And so we want to ensure that those people have the best health prospects going forward so that they are less vulnerable to the harms, not only of aging, but of aging in a warming environment. And in this video, I want to amplify towards the end of it some general prescriptions about how to foster greater collaboration between these two areas of science, which have had very little discussion to date. So I'm going to put on like the detective hat and do a kind of an autopsy of the actual scientific enterprise and identify what I see as an outsider, as a philosopher and political scientist, what I see as some of the obvious problems that could be redressed to create greater collaboration and understanding between the fields of science, of climate science and geroscience. So as I mentioned in the last video, I'm relying in this chapter on Philip Kitcher's articulation of responsible biology, where scientists see themselves as artisans working for the public good. And I suggest that this requires collaboration between distinct areas of scientific inquiry, both about climate change, but also about the biology of aging. And this aligns well with Maxwell's articulation of wisdom inquiry science, which is one of collaboration. And behind the red curtain, I'm going to reveal my, forensic report on the actual scientific enterprise, which comes up short of this ideal. But I want to suggest that there's some important ways understanding the non-ideal can help us position ourselves towards responsible biology. So here's some of the first major challenges. The first are what we can refer to as internal epistemic constraints, that there's a siloed knowledge production approach in science, right? If you work on the biology of aging, you're in that part of the university campus where they do experiments on mice, on fruit flies, but you're not necessarily interacting in a regular daily basis with people that are studying planetary health and climate science. And the journals that you're publishing in will be quite distinct. So you're reading journal articles, if you're a climate scientist, on climate change. If you're a biomedical gerontologist, you're reading about aging, gerontology. And so this siloed knowledge production of the actual scientific enterprise is part of the limitations. We need specialization, but we also need interdisciplinary linkages, and we need some outside-the-box thinking. And one of the real downsides of the professionalization of the scientific enterprise is that it rewards and is designed to maximize the careerist incentives, right? So what you're actually driven for, if you're an academic, is getting a job, getting tenure, getting promoted, getting research grants. Whether or not your research is actually best oriented towards the science that is most helpful to human welfare is often a distant consideration, if one at all. So careerist incentives, we've incentivized knowledge inquiry rather than wisdom inquiry science. Get published in the top tier journals, bring in those big research grants, tell the research funders what they want to hear. And all of these things can constrain the pursuit of collaboration in wisdom inquiry science. So I think there's some big internal epistemic constraints that need to be abated, and I'll suggest in a few moments how we might do that. But then if we reveal the other components of this, there are a whole range of features of our culture, the media, our politics that amplify some of the harms of these internal epistemic constraints. So one that we can identify is that when you're in a siloed approach to knowledge production, you're prone to what's called limited argument pool, right? You only talk to people that have the same beliefs and perspective that you do, and this makes you more convinced that you're right. So if climate scientists are only talking to themselves, they might say, well, we don't care at all about the science of healthy longevity. We've just got to abate the harms of climate change. And research on the biology of aging just seems like an eccentric novelty to pursue. Why would you actually want to increase the human lifespan or health span when we have climate change? And this is linked to group polarization, where we become more extreme. And this can occur conversely among geroscientists, where they all agree, well, we can manipulate the biology of aging, so maybe we'll actually be able to achieve radical life extension or biological immortality. And so if we had people talking with a more diverse group of scientists and interlocutors, we could reduce the prevalence of limited argument pools and reduce the prospects of group polarization. So I think it's particularly important for institutions of higher education in the 21st century to take interdisciplinarity seriously and ensure that there's broad discussions across scientific areas of inquiry to see common misunderstandings and common linkages between these often disparate areas of science. Another constraint on wisdom inquiry science is the negativity bias that is so prevalent in the media, right? In order for any area of science to get some time on TV or to make its way through social media, it typically needs to amplify a catastrophic frame. And climate science has, in last decade or so, made use of this. I'd say it's had some success, but also limitations. Whereas the field of healthy aging cannot actually deploy this because, as I've argued throughout the book, population aging is not something to catastrophize. The only scenario where populations are not aging is when we're all dying as children. And that's actually something to catastrophize. And that actually has been our historical challenge. But that's not to say that there are not significant challenges, such as a growing disparity between health span and lifespan. That is something I think that can be framed in a way that doesn't perpetuate ageism or catastrophize population aging, but perhaps can get some news coverage. So part of the challenge of science communication in an era of the medialization of science is that the science that primes the negativity bias gets more airtime. Therefore, it's going to get more resonate with people's attention. They have limited attention. If they hear some a headline that grabs their attention, then perhaps for a few moments they'll focus on that. So that that's happened with COVID-19. That it's happened with AI. It's happened with genetically modified crops. It's happened with climate change. And all of these things filter into the politicalization of science. When the public are worried about a particular issue or area of science, it all of a sudden becomes on the radar of politicians who, being opportunistic in wanting to get votes, will placate the fears or aspirations of the public by promising more resources being invested in the science. And this then creates a loop where the politicalization of science reinforces those careerist incentives and siloed knowledge production. So in particular, what I'm interested in my book is how can we move from the non-ideal scientific enterprise to something better approximating the ideals of responsible biology and wisdom inquiry science. And that's what I'm going to now focus on for the remainder of this video. So let's call this the ivory tower approach to knowledge production. It's siloed. You have biologists that study biology. You have computer scientists that, and physicists and chemists that throw sociology in there. But there's very little common discussion and substantive exchange of ideas between. And this really is, I've been working in a university my whole adult life, either as a student or as a faculty member, and 27 years as a faculty member. And, I've encountered this, decade after decade. It's extremely difficult to make progress against the siloed approach because there's a whole, people have invested decades of their career into a siloed approach to knowledge production. And the funding also is designed to facilitate this siloed approach to knowledge. So this results, as I note, in isolated research or very little collaboration among scientists in different areas of science. Now, Nicholas Maxwell, as I noted in previous videos, asks us, what kind of science, technology, and scholarship and education is best designed to help us promote human welfare and realize what is genuinely of value in life. That really should be like what's written, on the front page of every university, to get us to critically reflect on whether or not the type of education that we are producing is best equipped to help us advance the important moral interests that we have to advance in the 21st century. And wisdom inquiry science orients our minds towards this. But sadly, the dominance of knowledge inquiry science means that we don't kind of step back and ask in the big picture, what are we doing? We focus more on just publishing in certain journals or getting grants or getting tenure or promotion. And that comes at a cost of advancing the project of wisdom inquiry science. So one of the big issues then is the dominance of careerist incentives. We need to look at ways in which we can, while not abandoning the careerist incentives, they are important, but constrain or diversify them so that they knock down some of the dominance of the siloed approach to knowledge production. We want to replace this with an orientation towards wisdom inquiry versus knowledge inquiry science. So one of the first things is to get, looking out the window of the siloed approach, what are people working on in other fields? So that's the first kind of constraint that I want us to focus on, is how could we break down some of the barriers that arise from simply not having substantive interaction with researchers in other areas of science. And in particular for climate science and geroscience, these are the two areas of science that I'm going to focus on. And I do think there's some, real on the ground, modest proposals that could be made to actually have a meaningful effect. So remember, I describe myself as a pragmatist philosopher, which means I better offer some concrete prescriptions about how we could meaningfully move the scientific enterprise closer to the ideals of wisdom inquiry science and responsible biology. And the realm of ideas plays a big part in this. So I have the light bulbs representing the ideas, and I have the action, like what is the action that we need to take to move from the non-ideal to something better approximating the actual aspirations of science as a moral enterprise. So here's the first concrete step that I emphasize is to make other scientists conversationally present, right? This can range from things that, the physical design of a university to ensure that, you don't have all departments, on opposite ends of the campus. But in particular, for those working on climate science and those working on geroscience, how do you make them conversationally present? You can actually do this through the design of conferences, for example. So think about the design of scientific conferences. These are usually mostly designed for specialization, but you can at least have a few panels dedicated to bringing in outsiders to, constrain the effects of limited argument pool and group polarization. And this can apply both for a climate science conference. They can ensure you look at the themes design and say, well, do we have some sessions dedicated to the impact of climate change on older populations? And do we have some gerontologists or geriatricians presenting on the panels about what they're already observing about the impact climate change has on older persons? Or conversely, for a specialized conference on geroscience, to say, well, do we have scientists that are working on climate change that could actually present research that would be meaningful and useful for geroscientists to know. So I would say it's a responsibility for major scientific organizations to ensure some interdisciplinarity is represented in their conference programs so that we abate the narratives of intergenerational conflict that sadly are so prevalent, for example, in climate science. But by having them conversationally present, they'll actually get a much better understanding of how there's many shared aspirations between the biology of aging and climate change. So scientific conferences in climate science and geroscience might allocate specific panels to deal with the issues that arise at the intersection of the two fields, or to include discussants from the other field on some panels to help redress the impact of limited argument pools and group polarization. Right? So maybe you have a prominent plenary speaker on translational gerontology, but you have the discussant as somebody who works on climate change, and they offer the climate science perspective on the aspiration of translational gerontology. Or conversely, you have somebody who's the plenary speaker for a climate science conference, and then you have somebody with specialization in the biology of aging offering, kind of outsider's perspective on what some of the implications of what has been argued could be for the way people perceive older persons or the imperative to promote health in late life. Funding agencies could also be tweaked to incentivize collaboration. So they could require grant applicants to include some details of how translational science in either field could foster both intergenerational solidarity and planetary health. So require, funding of translational gerontology to have a component that addresses the issue of how this would be beneficial to planetary health, and have some funding requirement for climate science to address the issue of how this will yield some important value to promoting the health of older populations. This will help to abate some of the group polarization and limited argument pool effect that currently dominates both areas of science. And this one, I think there's an important role for scientific associations. You could do surveys, just run surveys, have a survey designed and informed by scientists working in the other field who have done a lot of research. So in gerontology, for example, they've come up with, a lot of research on framing aging and abating ageism. But unfortunately, that information is mostly consumed by geriatricians and gerontologists, but not by climate scientists. But if you were to run a survey, for example, where you ask climate scientists what they think about slowing aging, and that extends healthy life expectancy, are they in favor of that or not? If climate activists knew that 80 or 90% of climate scientists view favorably translational gerontology, they would drop some of the climate change activism that perpetuates ageism. And conversely, you could ask geroscientists what they think the ecological impact of slowing human aging will be. Maybe there's actually a whole range of important ecological impacts of facilitating healthy aging, but we haven't thought about them yet because we've been fixating solely on extending the human health span. So I think there's really important insights that could come from knowing what professional associations think, both in terms of changing the understanding of these other fields, but also abating some of the unhelpful frames that tend to be primed in a scenario where everyone's competing for the same limited research funding. Now, this could help abate the politicalization of science, which often leads advocates of both areas of science to adopt frames of tension and conflict that marginalize what I refer to as climate geroscience. All right, so in order to boost the funding in climate science, you might prime ageist narratives around the older persons or the climate culprits. And conversely, in order to boost research funding into translational gerontology, you might say, we just need to develop geroprotective drugs, and we don't need to worry so much about climate change. Both of these extreme perspectives are problematic. They compromise the science, but they also compromise a better understanding of the moral landscape. So I think it would be good if we could abate some of that and we're not going to escape the politicalization of science, but when it's more empirically accurate, we're more likely to steer democracy towards sound public policy decision-making rather than emotive or irrational decision-making. So in the next chapter, I'm going to be unpacking this. I couldn't cover everything I wanted to cover about climate science and translational gerontology in just this one chapter. In the next chapter, I'm going to open the door to what I call the geroscience perspective on One Health. I'm going to talk about what the One Health perspective is, and then I'm going to offer a distinctive interpretation of it that comes from translational gerontology so that we see that healthy aging is going to be something that is good for humans, for non-humans and for planetary health. So stay tuned for the next videos on chapter 12, which will be the final chapter of this book.